Please put your hands together. Welcome to the stage, Peter Godfrey Smith.
Okay, this talk will be a fast underwater tour of animal evolution, and in particular, the evolution of the mind. The first fact here, I think, is the fact that the mind evolved in the sea. This idea has several sides to it. Firstly, just the fact that for all the early stages, for the first and crucial period, until about 400 million years ago, just about all life and all animal life was in the sea. That was the context. And in that period before life on land, most of the essentials were laid down. So the evolution of animals themselves, the evolution of nervous systems and then brains, the evolution of complex senses such as eyes, and of bodies that can act in complex ways. And to some extent, all the rest is fine-tuning. Now, I'm not saying that everything was in place before we came up on land. Mammals certainly have special features, as do humans, but the basics were in place. And the question that then arises is whether what was in place included those aspects of the mind that philosophers have found most mysterious: subjective experience and consciousness. Now, this is a famously difficult question, but I think we can work towards answering it, and I think the answer to the question is yes. Now, one more aspect to the idea that the mind evolved in the sea is related to that last point. So when you think about how it's even possible for a physical system to have mental states, especially experiences, part of what makes this problem seem so hard, I think, so hard that people despair of it, is the fact that people have a particular picture of the physical in their heads when they think about this aspect of the problem. They have a kind of dry land, macroscopic picture of the physical and how physical things interact. Or perhaps they have in mind the particular kinds of interaction you find within present-day computers, with a processor or many processors, various kinds of memory, and a cascade of read and write operations. Now, I think this is part of what has steered people the wrong way. Not so much the computational electronic picture of the material, and I think that's an interesting topic to think about here at Google, but the more general picture of the physical and the earlier mechanistic conception, I think, has been a significant source of trouble here. Instead, we should think about the distinctive properties of cellular life, the particular kinds of goings-on within cells. That's an aqueous environment and a nanoscale environment. Everything is in water, in solution. There's continual spontaneous activity, and the way things get done within a cell is by means of essentially a multitude of biased random walks. So the physical itself is different in the sea and in cells. Now, I'm not saying that's itself enough to remove all mystery, but I think it's important to think in the right way about the biological basis of the mind as we think about this problem. And when animals moved up on land, this is an animal that has not yet moved up on land, they took all this with them. They hauled up in their cells the chemistry of the sea where they came from. Now, as the title of my book suggests, we're working towards the special role in this story of octopuses and other cephalopods, but we're not there yet. The next thing to think about is the overall shape of the history of animal life. Now, life in general forms the shape of a tree, roughly speaking. So from a single root, a series of branching events, usually with no rejoinings, extend to the present day. There are branchings and then divergence. This process began with single-celled life. We don't know the original forms, but based on what we know about single-celled organisms now, the picture to have in your mind is not little cells that are self-contained, little islands, but systems that are open to the world, sensing and responding, exhibiting behaviour, including even social behaviour on a tiny scale. Now, animals are one branch of multicellular life, and the first way to think about animals is they are one pretty big branch of the tree of life, a branch that comes off around 900 million years ago or so, perhaps. And in that transition to multicellular life, the sensing and signaling that cells had been doing as whole organisms in the unicellular state is now used to coordinate activities of cells within the new collective entities that had arisen, making possible coordinated and coherent action. So the social behavior of cells becomes the means for all animal action. Now, there's no fossil record of the very earliest stages. The first stages of the history of animal life that we do have a fossil record of are from the Ediacaran period, roughly 635 to 540 million years ago. This is a photo of a fossil of a typical Ediacaran fossil in the South Australian Museum, and it's the sort of round thing that is the likely animal fossil, something that looks a little bit like a bath mat. So life was very different back then. All animals were soft-bodied, and life also seems to have been fairly quiet. This is, I think, a gorgeous reconstruction of Ediacaran life by the English artist John Sibbick. And one of the distinctive things that this sort of illustration captures is the fact that animals, well, it's not even clear which of these living things were animals, but animals in particular don't seem to have had too much to do with each other. Many of them probably didn't move around at all. So that's the first stage. And now I want to start to place all this into a larger historical context, also looking forward. So there's a summary picture of part of the animal branch of the tree of life. This is from the book. So with all these tree pictures, you should think of time as running up the screen. And the first, so we have a series of branchings giving rise to, at the top, various different present-day kinds of organisms. Vertebrates there on the left, mollusks including cephalopods, which I'll talk about shortly, arthropods including insects, then you get things like jellyfish and sponges. And the next thing to note is that many of the deep branchings in animal evolution took place in the Ediacaran period. That's when the sort of separations occurred. Now here's another picture, not from the book, from another paper of mine. What the orange band there represents is the fact that the deep historical branchings giving rise to various present-day groups, those branchings took place in the Ediacaran at this time of very limited interaction. A particularly important animal living at that time might have looked something like this. This is a sort of little worm-like creature. There's no fossil record of it. This is very much a sort of tentative reconstruction. But it was something like the first animal that had left-right symmetry as part of its body plan. It had a left and right as well as a top and bottom. And this body plan evolved in the Ediacaran. Most of the animals that we're familiar with are bilaterian animals. They have that kind of left-right plan that was originally laid down in something like this. This was probably a very small animal. Quite simple. It did have a nervous system, almost certainly, but a simple nervous system, most likely. So on a slide like that, we have that animal placed at its particular moment in the tree, and everything downstream, sort of on its branch, is a bilaterally symmetrical organism, including ourselves and animals like octopuses. So the branchings occurred early, before what's known as the Cambrian explosion. Then in the Cambrian, life changed dramatically. Rather than soft-bodied animals that looked a bit like macaroons or bath mats, you have animals that looked something like this. You have hard parts, spines, claws. You have complex sensory mechanisms, especially complex eyes. And it is very likely that this is when animals began to have much more to do with each other, especially as predators and prey. From there you get lots of downstream evolution, and this takes us through something that can be roughly summarized with a picture like this. Lots of animals come from this early bilaterian lineage, and in a few groups you have the evolution of large brains and complex behavior. You have, firstly, the evolution of large brains and complex behavior in our group, in the vertebrates. Many vertebrates are like this, especially mammals and birds. And in what we informally refer to as invertebrates, all the others, you mostly have animals that have small nervous systems and relatively simple behaviour, but with one big exception, the cephalopods, a group of mollusks. Here we have a large nervous system, one in the vertebrate range, roughly 500 million neurons in the case of an octopus. And the most recent common ancestor of you on one side and an octopus on the other with its very large nervous system was that very simple worm-like creature living in the Ediacaran 600 million years ago. So what we really have is independent evolution from that point down two sides, and something we can think of as two independent experiments, evolutionary experiments, in the origin of large nervous systems and complex brains. So a cephalopod is what we're looking at the results of the one experiment outside our line in the evolution of a really large nervous system. And I think of this consequently as the closest we'll ever come to meeting an intelligent alien. When I say that, I mean the following. If you think about what it would be like to meet an alien, the big fact about an alien is that it's an intelligent form of life that has no common ancestor with us at all, something from a totally separate evolutionary lineage. An octopus is certainly not like that, but the common ancestor is so far away and probably quite simple, and as a result, most of what we see arose independently in the roughly 600 million years ago since that common ancestor. So what did we get on the other side, and why did we get it? Well, we get a mixture of similarities and differences from things like ourselves. The most conspicuous similarity between a cephalopod and a vertebrate is the eye. Cephalopods independently evolved a camera eye. So this is a giant cuttlefish, which has the same kind of eye as an octopus. A camera eye with a lens that focuses an image on a retina. You also have various sophisticated kinds of learning. And lastly, something that was really the beginning of my own fascination with these animals, there's a kind of engagement that these animals display when you interact with them. The first ones I came across myself were not octopuses, but giant cuttlefish like this guy here. This animal was probably sort of between 2 and 3 feet long. They're not small. I was snorkeling near Sydney and saw under a ledge something moving around, went down and had a look at it. And as I thought from the surface, it was a large animal and something very active. And the two most striking things about it were, firstly, the astounding array of colour changes that it was producing as I watched it. These animals can change the entire colour of their skin in much less than a second. And secondly, the fact that this animal seemed about as interested in me as I was in it. There's a kind of a feeling of meeting you can have with these animals, which is, I take it, unique when a person meets another invertebrate, and quite rare when we meet any animal. Just to give you a sense of the capacity for colour change, these two photographs were taken 4 seconds apart. So a giant cuttlefish can completely transform its skin to that yellow in less than a second, and then take it back to that reddish pattern a few seconds later. And this image also gives you a sense of the fact that it's not just whole colours that they can produce, but very complex stripes and bands, dynamic as well as static patterns as well. So how did there come to be animals that could do these things? Let's talk a little bit about the cephalopod brain and the kind of being that these animals are. So as I said, there are roughly 500 million neurons in an octopus. The number is not really known for cuttlefish, but they may have even a slightly higher ratio of brain weight to body weight than octopuses have. The big difference between them and us is the fact that more than half of the neurons in an octopus are not where you'd expect to find them in the head, but spread through the body, especially within the arms themselves. And each of the arms appears to have some degree of autonomy as a kind of quasi-agent. Now, how did this come to happen? We can put some of it into context by looking at the lives that were lived and the history of this particular group. So here's a reconstruction of what an ancestor, an early-ish ancestor of present-day cephalopods might have looked like back in the Paleozoic. This is a large shelled predator. At some point in animal evolution, the shells were abandoned, and what you're left with was a body with a kind of immense flexibility. You should think, by the way, about an octopus's arms or a cuttlefish's arms, not so much as arms, but really as kind of 8 or 10 enormous lips. And those enormous multi-shaped lips are extremely useful things if you can control them, but they are extremely difficult things to control. Now in us, when we move, our joints give our movements guidance. You don't have to tell your arm every detail about where to go. In an octopus with no joints and no hard parts at all, the arm can be essentially any shape and length. So you would either have to specify exactly the fine details of all its motions, or give the arm a little bit of freedom to work out the details of its motions itself. And it does seem that there has been a sort of partial delegation of control to the arms of an octopus by evolution. Each arm has many senses. Whenever an octopus touches you, it's tasting you as well as feeling your shape. And they seem to do they seem to sort of determine at least the details of many of their motions themselves, and also engage in a kind of exploration on their own. So here are a couple of photos that give you a sense of the contrast here. So firstly, we have two screenshots from a video in which this octopus is reaching aggressively for another one. And in a shot like this, the arm seems very much like a sort of tool directed by the animal as a whole. It's reaching with one arm for this guy. And in this case, successfully seizing it. This kind of picture gives the opposite impression. I don't have a video of this sequence, unfortunately, just an image, but an octopus sort of sitting there doing nothing in particular. And one of the arms, the red arrow there indicates the extent of it, has just kind of wandered off in a way that looked to me as if it was apparently more or less self-directed, a kind of exploratory behavior by the arm on its own. Now, given all this, a natural question to ask next is, what might it be like to be an octopus? Is it like anything to be an octopus? Look, I mean, these questions are, of course, very hard to answer. I think the answer, does it feel like something to be an octopus, is yes. The harder question is how to address rigorously a problem of that kind. Now, the first thing to note, I think, is that a reasonable view has it that a certain kind of experience in animals just comes with a certain degree of complexity in sensing and responding and acting upon the world. That runs deep in animal evolution. Octopuses are exemplars of that kind of capacity. Another more specific thing I think it's worth looking for is evidence of things like pain. So lots of what might look superficially like pain-related behaviors in various animals, especially invertebrates, are probably or possibly quite misleading. They may not be good indicators of felt pain, of a kind of interior sensation of the sort that comprises pain in us. So then the question arises, how can you look for a behavior that shows something non-reflexive, something that's indicative or suggestive at least, that it feels like something to be an animal of a certain kind in pain? And one good example that's been looked at in several groups recently is wound tending. You can ask the question, which animals will tend a damaged part, protect it from being touched by other objects and stimuli as time goes on? We got an interesting series of shots of an octopus exhibiting pain-related behavior. This is, in some ways, a sort of comical shot, not so much for the octopus, I think. This was a large, aggressive octopus who was trying to dominate a particular site I'll talk about shortly. And one of the things he did in his attempts to dominate was raise his rear end very high above his body in these sort of size displays. And in one particular occasion where he raised his rear end very high, a fish came in and bit him really hard right on the end of his body there. And you can see the fish biting. These fish, by the way, are very unpleasant to bite even if you're a person. I've been bitten by them and it's not nice. the octopus behaved exactly like a person, sort of with this very startled leap and arms going everywhere. I was curious whether he would tend the wound. He did not. Instead, he went back to beating up other octopuses. So an octopus has sort of reasonably good evidence, I think, of various kinds of subjective experience. The special element, and the question I think that's particularly intriguing here, concerns what kind of sense of self there might be in an animal of this kind, and how different that would be in an octopus and in a more centralized, neurally centralized animal like ourselves. So we can ask which activities an octopus engages in are experienced as my actions, as authored by the individual, as opposed to things that just happen and are observed by the central animal by means of those semi-agent-like arms. In a talk I gave last week, a grad student at University of Pennsylvania made a suggestion that's sort of obvious in retrospect, but I hadn't thought about it much before, which is that, well, there need not be a single answer to this question. It might be that when an octopus is doing a very sort of focused, intentional behavior, like that reach in the photo I had there, then there's a kind of single agent-like subjective experience. But that might sort of lapse or fall away and be replaced by a more distributed, less self-like entity when you're seeing individual exploration by the arms. So these are some of the questions that we'd like to ask, a sort of mixture of philosophical and scientific questions about these animals. And work is continuing on this. In the last part of this talk, what I'll do is just show some shots and some videos from a particular site where a lot of these photos were taken, an octopus site that we call Octopolis, which is written about in some detail in the book. This is a site on the east coast of Australia. Okay, here's the first video. Oh, there we go. This just gives you a sense of what this site is like on a sort of typical day. You've got a large number of shells on a shell bed and various octopuses who are in residence. And what's believed about octopuses in general is they're not very social animals. It's unusual for them to have to interact with each other in decent numbers. But at this particular site in Australia that we study, they've essentially had to learn to get along. The view we have is that it's a site where there's an abundance of food, but a great scarcity of decent den sites, and one particular area, an area that was perhaps seeded by a single human-left object of unknown origin, provided a kind of seed around which a crystal-like growth occurred whereby octopuses came to live in large numbers. And a lot of the time they engage in sort of mild controlled aggression. Occasionally they engage in more intense aggression. So this animal on the left here is in fact the octopus who was bitten on the rear end by the fish we saw earlier. And this is a sort of typical day for him, engaging in a series of fights where he attempts to control access to this pretty large site, a site about the size of this stage. And he appeared to be able, so far as we could tell, to determine with some reliability the sexes of individuals coming on and off the site, and tried to exclude other males. So he engaged in a series of fights and much of the time did succeed in excluding them. A feature that's also unique at this site is a kind of signaling. This is the kind of display I talked about briefly earlier, where animals who are aggressive will go up very large and dark, maximizing their darkness and size. And if you look closely at the animal who it is about to chase, you'll see this animal has gone pale, but more specifically, you'll see that it has done a color change such that half of its body, the half facing the attacking octopus, is a kind of high contrast mottled sort of color, and the other half of its body, facing away, is a kind of simple camouflage. Now, we're not sure exactly why that is. The sort of high contrast pattern on the side facing has a role in various cephalopod behaviors as a kind of sometimes called a dematic display. The idea is you show this to a predator and it might startle the predator. It's possible it's being sort of pressed into service as an attempt to, in a futile way, startle this oncoming octopus. However, many individuals produce this display when they're not trying to run away, but trying to kind of creep onto the site under the gaze of another animal in a non-aggressive manner. So we suspect that it may have been pressed into service as a kind of indicator of non-aggressive tendencies in these animals. And then the question arises, is this something that is a widespread but hitherto unseen feature of this behaviour across the species, or is it something that just develops in the particular peculiar social milieu of this site? Another thing that's an unusual feature of this site is what we've come to call a kind of high five behaviour. So this octopus on the right there is moving across towards the others, and as it goes, there'll often be a kind of, I originally called this boxing, but now I realise I was being too pugilistic in my metaphors. And it might be a kind of slap of recognition or of something like indication of roles on the site that animals do by just jabbing at each other with their arms. This is a picture of me at the site trying to fix a camera while a whole bunch of stuff goes on around me, none of which I'm able to see going on. So we only sometimes successfully look at them. They often quite successfully observe us. This is an octopus inspecting one of our GoPro cameras, possibly as a preliminary to taking it apart. So I'll stop there. Happy to take a few questions. I think you'll agree these are truly fascinating and stunning animals.
Thanks for the talk. It was very, very cool to see that. So probably the most remarkable thing about the mammalian experiment with intelligence, I would say, is our incredible memories. It's difficult to imagine what my sense of self would be like without that kind of memory. What kind of memory do the cephalopods have?
There's some interesting new work on this in cuttlefish, which is interesting particularly in continuities between the human and this case. So in the case of humans, there's sort of a standard distinction between forms of memory. The sort of memory of how to do things, procedural memory, what's called semantic memory, memory of facts, the fact that Paris is the capital of France. And episodic memory is memory of what happened to you, of experiences. And the kind of memory that you were describing as very sort of distinctive to human experiences is that kind. So a good question is, which animals might have something like episodic memory? Memory not just of facts, where things are, but of what experiences I had when I was in that place. And recently, some work that's been used to study episodic memory, or rather episodic-like memory in birds, has been also applied to cuttlefish. And I won't describe all the details of the experimental design, which was very clever and subtle, but the upshot of it was that it appears that cuttlefish do have the ability to remember not just facts like, this food can be found there, but facts of the form, I was at this location an hour ago and ate, or I was at this other location 2 hours ago and didn't eat. So a sense of a kind of, not just sort of facts about the world, but facts about what I have done and where I have been. So, this I find especially enticing because things like this, there's just no chance that was present in a common ancestor of us and these animals. So independently, the same kind of sense of a self behaving in time appears to have arisen in several different lines.
Great, thank you.
What do we know about the visual processing in these animals? You said that the eye is quite similar to the human eye. Does the animal have a similarly organized visual cortex?
Not similarly. In general, once you get past the eye, everything becomes different in these animals. I'm not that knowledgeable about the neurophysiology of vision in octopuses. I can certainly tell you where to look. The lab, or one of the labs that specializes in this is Benny Hockner's lab at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. They're probably the leading lab with respect to the project of trying to work out, how different the organizational properties are of an octopus's brain and ours. And one thing that they're looking at and have sort of made some claims about is the idea that within our brains you have quite a number of sort of map-like structures where the sort of sensory array on the body maps to sort of adjacent or neighbor-related neurons in the brain. And that seems to be absent in octopuses. And you might think, oh, right, that has some link to the idea that there's too many degrees of freedom to control centrally, so you leave that stuff to the arms. Or it might have some other explanation, I don't know. But his papers would be the ones to look at.
Thank you.
Hi. It's really nice to see an actively researching scientist not deflationist about subjective experience. It's pretty refreshing. But I just wanted to say, you were getting at our very linear view on what conscious experience is like as potentially clouding our view on like what it can be and how to fit it into a scientific worldview. But you didn't really flesh out like what sort of future research program you had in mind for the types of different organizations of, say, C-like cells for the future of fitting subjective experience into the scientific kind of canon. So what sort of research program for solving the Chalmers-style hard problem do you envision?
Okay, that's a very big question indeed. And my answer would be sort of so many-pronged that it's sort of hard to organize it in a brief reply. But let me say a couple of things just very quickly. One is, I think that with respect to the sorts of challenges that people like Chalmers make, some of that should be treated in a more critical way, where we say, no, this kind of barrier is not real, or this problem for a materialist view is not real. So I think a first move that one should make is to reorient our thinking about the problem in a way that's more critical about the sort of imaginable separability of the mental and the physical, the basis for the arguments of Chalmers and others. So criticize that. Then choose the right thing to explain. And I think the right thing to explain is not sort of consciousness as the sort of first target, or what philosophers often refer to as qualia, the kind of raw feel of experience, but subjectivity. That's the right target. How is it that some physical systems can comprise subjects that have a point of view? Once you understand that and where they came from, I think it'll be possible to explain subjective experience as something that happens to subjects. Now, how can we give a scientific road in to the understanding of subjectivity in a sense that's relevant to that question? Here I think there are lots of things to think about. I mean, giving a talk at Google, it's very tempting to say something about attempts to come up with artificial systems that are relevant. And I think what evolution had to do, that was a big deal in this area, was take quasi-autonomous cells that can sense and signal and interact in certain ways, and that have a kind of subject-like status in a very minimal sense on their own, and coordinate them such that the sort of proto-subjectivity of those parts becomes sort of, subsumed might not be quite the right word, but it'll do for now, into the subjectivity of the collective that results. I think classical AI did not think about the problem like that at all. And even contemporary robotics tends to start from a more sort of straightforwardly centralized organization. And I certainly think it would be intriguing to sort of think about the problem via the same path by which evolution thought about the problem, which is unity and collectivity with respect to systems of that kind.
Thanks. This is a great talk.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
That's fine. Please go ahead.
Okay.
We've got time for both.
Yeah, sorry. A lot of what I've been reading about intelligence from a sort of neuroscience point of view seems to me to lead in the direction of saying that intelligence, as we understand it, is sort of irreducibly social. I think the signaling and the signaling aspect and the idea of a sense of self coming out of a model of others, and so I'm intrigued because it seems that these animals are capable of very, very complex signaling, but also you said they're not very social. So I wonder how much do you think their intelligence is social, is engaged in signaling and sensing the other animals?
I think for the most part, cephalopods are a lesson pushing against those highly socialized conceptions of intelligence that are very popular in many theoretical domains at the moment. So if you, I mean, as a philosopher much of the time, there are some philosophers who emphasize the sort of to and fro of sociality, and there are some philosophers who emphasize the richness of the individual's experience and of particularity. And cephalopods are sort of they're with the second group. They're with William James, a sort of individualist style. I think that's just something we learn from them. We learn that by means of some kind of combination of the challenges of living the lives they live, where they're soft-bodied, they're prey for anything of a decent size in the sea. They're also predators. They have to get around. They have to be continually exploring and looking for food. And with the bodies that are both so rich with possibility but so hard to control, I think we learned that that's enough just to build a very big and complex nervous system. Once you have that big and complex nervous system, it appears that if you put a bunch of them together in an unusually high-density setting, they'll, here I'm going beyond what I can back up scientifically, so I'm here being very speculative. I think a lot of the signalling behaviours that we see at Octopolis, the site in Australia, are a kind of improvised sociality. I think the animals sort of work out a way with their general cleverness to interact in ways that are not too sort of destructive and chaotic. So I think they're sort of a case on that side. Just while we're talking about the ways in which they push against the familiar ways of talking about or thinking about the advantages in evolutionary terms of having a large brain and high intelligence, the other weird thing about these animals is their lives are so short. An octopus is dead usually within 2 years, which is astounding. So in 2 years, they kind of rush through their early stages and acquire quite a large body in many cases. Even the giant Pacific octopus, which is several hundred pounds of octopus, they can live often to about 4 years, but that's about it, and that's the biggest octopus species known. No one knows the lifespan of a giant squid, the really colossal squid, but it's thought to be of the same kind of order of 5 years or so. So they rush through their lives, and that would normally be thought to be something that tells against the advantage of developing a large brain. All that learning, you've got no time to put it to any use. So it just compounds the puzzle in many ways.
Great, thanks.
Yes.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. So what do you think about the correlation between parenting and intelligence? Because octopi do have kind of parenting.
Not of the sort that should help. That's sort of the perfect
there is some kind
follow-up.
of parenting. They do care about their young.
Only about the eggs.
Yeah.
So this is exactly the right sort of next puzzle to sort of mention after the previous gentleman's questions. So in many animals that are smart, you have significant parental care and the guidance of the next generation along the first steps. With octopuses, in general, I'll mention an exception in a moment, or a couple of exceptions in a moment. The general pattern is, so the female octopus lays some eggs, and she tends and broods them and fans them to get exactly the right level of oxygen in the water that they're interacting with. And the eggs hatch, and the larvae float away as plankton, and that's it. And she never sees them again. So there's care in the sense of, the eggs are not abandoned. Cuttlefish eggs, by the way, are abandoned. So the female cuttlefish lays eggs often on a ledge, on the underside of a ledge, and then just goes off. And those eggs will hatch. They're larger and better provisioned than octopus eggs, and they're a bit more robust. But when they hatch, the parents are long gone, dead, in fact. And with octopuses, there's a bit more care, but not care that you would think would help with the sort of intellectual side of life very much, because once the eggs hatch, the larvae just become plankton. Now, there are a few exceptions where the larvae may at least settle locally. The larvae are larger when the eggs hatch and don't just float away and become plankton. Not very much is known about them. There are a few sort of larger egged octopuses. But even in that, I think in general the picture is, if you're an octopus, from the day that you're hatching from the egg, you're pretty much on your own, and your days are numbered. Yeah.
So you mentioned the tree structure of life lineage, and you mentioned that in some cases there are junctions. I wonder if you could mention an example of those.
Right. So once you get to animals, genuine junctions tend not to occur. But in single-celled life, so in bacteria, you have a quite different shape. I mean, the tree metaphor or the tree model doesn't apply particularly well to bacteria. They're continually exchanging bits and pieces of DNA in a kind of free way. The eukaryotic cells that make up our bodies are the products of an event where one old, ancient prokaryotic cell essentially swallowed another, and the two of them came to live as a unit. So that's a kind of merging in the tree where all the cells in your body are descended from a merging event that took place perhaps something like 1.8 billion years or so ago. So if you think about the tree of life in a more exact way, you should think that it's a network. The network in its old and unicellular domains or regions has a sort of somewhat haphazard, not really tree-like, but more complex structure. And then in some groups, especially animals, the thing sort of resolves into a more definite tree where you have two-way branchings and few or no, not none, but few or no rejoinings. So the full picture is not quite a tree, but we animals, we form a pretty good tree. Okay, it's time for one more if anyone would like to hop up.
So you had an illustration of the common ancestor of the octopus and mammals.
Yeah.
From my perspective, when I look at an octopus, it seems to have a lot of similarities with mammals, just in terms of the level of advancement and complexity. And some things like you mentioned the design of the eye are quite similar.
Yeah.
How much of that do you think was like latent in the DNA versus how much of that was truly independent because it was required in the same way? Do you think that there were independent mutations in the DNA that were independently selected for?
It's a very good question, and the words you used, latent, I think is exactly the right, that's the right way to ask the question. So you have some similarities of design in the present coming from something that looks very different in the past. And there's a school of thought in biology that I think would answer your question with a kind of emphatic yes. They'd say, oh yeah, right, they look very different, but there was a kind of architecture that was kind of latent in a way in the first bilaterally symmetrical animals with a certain kind of head to tail axis, a certain organization of the relationship between nervous system and the rest. And, you should think of the subsequent unfolding down the two lines as just a kind of, the variations on a theme in a way, and a theme that was set down early. That's one kind of school of thought. I'm describing this a bit metaphorically, but I think it's clear in this case. Then there's another, and in some ways more traditional school of thought that says, look, evolution can do anything it pretty much wants with bodies. And you start with something very simple, and the fact that you have certain similarities here and here means that natural selection just favored similar things, and there were mutations occurring quite independently, quite different in character, that built a similar structure. Now, in the case of having an eye with a lens, the second view is certainly right. So there's no sense in which the eye lens was latent in the common ancestor. And octopus lenses and vertebrate lenses are built from different stuff. They have a different role. So one distorts and one moves. So camera lenses don't distort, they move. Some animal lenses distort, they change shape, and some of them move. But the presence of an eye at all in the animal, forget the lens and the particular structure, but just whether you have light-sensitive things roughly where they are, plenty of biologists think, yes, that was probably laid down, and it's not something that was independently invented, it's something that was laid down one time. So, I mean, my expertise, such as it is such that I can't give a sort of richer answer to the question than that, because what you're putting your finger on there is a part of biology which is intensely and actively debated, and there are different reasonable positions. Okay, it's about 5:02. Is it natural to wrap up round about now? Okay, thanks.